Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 34 of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. Today we're going to discuss the story of the Seleucid rule in what today we tend to call the Middle East. And we're chiefly going to focus in on Judea and the impact which Greek civilization had upon Jewish civilization, because this little strip of land is going to become increasingly important in world history as we advance, especially since we're talking about religion and intellectual history. Before moving forward, I just want to make a quick comment about the term Middle East. A lot of us take it for granted as a designation, but what most people don't know is that it's a relatively recent term. It was first used by the British in colonial times to describe that pesky chunk of land which lay between the Queen and her crown jewel, India. So everything between here and there was just, in the middle of what really mattered. And, these lands were owned by that sick man of Europe, those terrible Turks, and, if we could just get them out of the way, we should all be richer for it. Anyhow, I still use this term because, let's face it, etymology does not dictate meaning, and I think, by and large, most people aren't implying or advocating any sort of colonialist mindset when they use the term. They're just trying to give you a vague geographical coordinate. So, moving on. Let's go back in time just a little to back before Alexander's death, during his great campaign, while he was entering Jerusalem for the first time. Alexander arrived during the reign of the high priest Simon the Just, and so most historians agree this happened around 329 BC. The Talmud describes the drama of the first encounter, wherein the high priest Simon the just comes out to greet Alexander with the other members of the priesthood and the sages of the Sanhedrin. Now, the story goes, and whether this actually happened is another matter, but when Alexander saw Simon, he dismounted and bowed. When he was questioned about this strange behavior, he told them that whenever he went into battle, he would dream of an angel leading him into victory. The face of this Jewish high priest, he said, was the face of that angel he saw in his dreams. And that's why he bowed down to him. Right. Anyhow, Alexander was positively disposed toward the Jews because he was generally positively disposed toward all the people he conquered. Instead of destroying and subjugating the people, he knocked the upper elite crust out and made arrangements with the lesser nobility. As long as everyone agreed to be his loyal vassals and pay their taxes, they could remain autonomous. Now, in gratitude to Alexander, the Jews did a couple of things. First, they agreed to name every child born the next year Alexander. And to this day, Alexander, or Sender for short, is a common Jewish name. And, let's face it, it's common to everybody. From this point onward, however, we start seeing lots of Jews giving their children Greek names. After naming their children in Greek, the Jews unwittingly opened the door to the Greek language. And with the Greek language, it wasn't long until Greek culture followed. Let's not forget, there were also Jews in Alexandria, and these would have learned to speak Greek as well. Now, like I said, as long as you were a good little servile underling and you paid your extortion fees to foreign rulers, nobody would hurt you. This was the time in which the people of Judea had to install a system of foreign tax collection and money exchange, which would ultimately become a source of extreme corruption. The Talmud holds that any and all tax collectors are thieves, and in the New Testament, we can see how tax collectors for the Romans are usually the most despised people on the planet. this stigma starts here under Alexander, and this enduring disdain for the foreign taxman endured in Judea long after Alexander was gone. Now, obviously, Alexander had not planned to die at an early age, so his death left the world in chaos. The man who had the known world in his pocket was suddenly not there to keep it together. So, as far as the Middle East is concerned, Alexander's empire split into two distinct parts. The northern part became ruled by Seleucus and was well known as the Seleucid dynasty. This was based out of the city of Damascus, while the southern half was ruled by Ptolemy and based out of the city of Alexandria, which we discussed in the last lecture. Now, for all intents and purposes, these two generals could agree on virtually everything except the dividing line between their respective territories. And it was the land of Israel which would ultimately stand smack dab in the heart of their disagreement. And of course, the Jews were caught up in all this drama, spilling over from the world scene. The history of the Jews for about the next 130 years would be a balancing act between placating the two neighboring political giants. And all this was to be done without losing their souls in the process. Sometimes the Jews teetered in their political persuasions to the south and sometimes toward the north. The south would usually attempt to win the Jewish people over by persuasion and culture, while the north would attempt to do so by force. And then, of course, the Jews are not a monolithic hive mind entity. There would be differing factions with differing opinions on the matter for nearly the following 2 centuries. Now, the pseudonymously written Book of Daniel, written at some time during the 2nd century, is a book comprised of numerous vaticinium ex eventu, that is, prophecies after the event. And in reality, these prophecies were written about the Seleucid tyrant of the day, King Antiochus. Daniel chapter 7, verse 3-7 tells us of a terrifying apocalyptic vision. And in it, there are 4 beasts, each one more frightening than the other, emerging from the sea. According to Jewish tradition, namely the Midrash, each of these beasts were thought to have represented one of the 4 major empires which would put Israel into bondage: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then finally Rome. The Greeks in question here were specifically the Seleucids, the Hellenistic empire ruled by the dynasty founded in 312 by Seleucus I Nicator, or conqueror. This empire/kingdom would stand, albeit in various shapes and sizes, until it was dissolved by the Roman general Pompey the Great in 63 BC. Seleucus inherited Babylon after the death of Alexander, and from there he expanded his territories to include most of the Near and Middle East. At the height of his power, this empire included the Levant, Central Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Persia, Afghanistan, and shares of Pakistan and Turkmenistan too. The Seleucid Empire, unlike the more Egyptian-flavored Ptolemaic Empire, was a major center of Hellenistic culture, which upheld the preeminence of Greek traditions. Typically, this was in urban areas where local elites congregated. In the countryside, it was generally business as usual. Now, over the decades, Greek populations in these eastern cities were gradually reinforced by immigration from Greece. Greece is a rocky place, there's not much food there, so the Greeks were always spilling out of the mainland in search of new riches, adventure, or whatever. and this explains why the travel romance became a big literary genre during this period. But in any case, Seleucid expansion into Anatolia and Greece proper would be decisively stopped after encountering that entity, which will become more and more important in these lectures, and which I've largely been neglecting because I don't even know where to start. But that entity was the Roman army. Now, something I want to stress about the Seleucid Empire is that despite the further injection of Greek culture into the Middle East, there was a great deal of continuity from earlier times when the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Persians ruled the land. The official language of the Seleucids was Greek, but they also issued decrees in Persian and Aramaic in order to get their point across. Usually, ignorance of the law is not a valid defense, but if the laws are literally not written in the only language that you speak, you're in deep waters. With respect to religion, Seleucid areas outside of Jerusalem might best be thought of as a giant syncretic stew of Greek Olympianism, diverse forms of Babylonian and Assyrian paganism, and let's not forget Zoroastrianism, which never really went away and won't, at least not in any significant way, until the coming of Islam. Now, way off in the east, after several defeats at the hands of the Indian Chandragupta Maurya of the Mauryan Empire, who we've discussed in a little detail in a previous lecture, Seleucus accepted a peace treaty wherein he ceded a huge chunk of land west of the Indus, and this included the Hindu Kush, modern-day Afghanistan, and parts of Pakistan. As part of the treaty, Seleucus even offered up his daughter for marriage to the emperor in order to seal the deal. In return, he got 500 elephants. Not a bad deal, if you ask me. These served him quite well in upcoming battles. And it's said that Chandragupta had fielded an army of 600,000 men and 9,000 war elephants. So, yielding the eastern fringe of your empire to such a threat seems of no surprise. Now, not long after this, many more parts of the Eastern Empire fell to the Parthians under Mithridates I in the mid-2nd century BC. The Parthians were kind of tribal steppe nomad people who would become a real thorn in the side of a lot more people than just Seleucus. Nevertheless, Seleucid kings maintained a very wealthy swath of land for quite some time. Culturally, they were the inheritors of Persia and Babylon, making them a real player on the world scene until their ultimate overthrow by Rome. You know, it's not for nothing that around the beginning of the 2nd century, writers referred to the Seleucid rulers as the King of Syria or the Lord of Asia. Now, I'm not going to give you a dry prosopographical rundown of the Seleucids and their individual achievements or losses. And honestly, I wouldn't be qualified to do it justice anyhow. I'm really not interested in the minutiae of battles and politics and dynastic succession, though I recognize the importance of these things. Instead, I'm going to skip ahead a few decades and a few rulers, actually, and start us back off in the 2nd century BC. Judea had first come under Ptolemaic rule after the death of Alexander, but it fell to the Seleucids around 200 BCE. Judea by this time had already been affected, or infected, depending who you ask, by Hellenization. Some Jews, mainly those from the urban upper classes, most notably the Tobiad family, these were more in favor of doing away with Jewish law and really taking hold of the Greek lifestyle. Going to the gym, working out in the nude, reading pagan poetry and philosophy, not getting your dick mutilated, going to see plays, and that sort of thing. Hellenizing Jews built gymnasia in Jerusalem, They competed in international games, they tried to hide their circumcisions, and they, quote, repudiated the Holy Covenant. Okay, so just before I jump into talking about Maccabees, I want to take a minute to point out some really obvious similarities and differences between Hellenistic and Judean religion. Most of these are probably evident to you, but let's just do a quick run through because all these points are relevant. As far as language is concerned, Greeks are Indo-Europeans, Jews are Semites. Greeks thought they were the center of the world and all other people were barbarians, while Jews believed that they were the chosen people of the one and only true God Yahweh. Greeks were syncretic polytheists, and the Jews were strict monotheists. Greeks demonstrated a great degree of local variability in their religious practices. Jewish devotion was centered upon the consistent brand offered up by Solomon's temple at Jerusalem. Greek religion was by and large ritualistic, and Jewish religion was as well, but it also upheld a strong moral and legal dimension which Greek religion lacked. They had to get that dimension from philosophy. It didn't come from religion. Greek sacrifice was typically public and about communal binding, whereas Jewish sacrifice was private and concerned with upholding the letter of the law and keeping covenant. Both cultures had complex notions of purity and pollution, but they didn't see eye to eye on all the details. These are just a few among many more sets of comparisons and contrasts which we should keep in mind moving forth, because we've discussed the Greeks and the Hebrews quite a lot over the duration of this series, and it's only now that we're getting their coming together that will lead to a number of pressures which will ultimately cause the whole region to destabilize. So, here's where things start getting ugly, and most of it had to do with who's sitting on that great proverbial throne of high priest over the Second Temple. The most respected position in all of Judea, a virtual slaughterhouse, choking with incense, run with utmost piety and attention to ritual purity. When Antiochus IV Epiphanes became ruler of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BC, a Hellenized Jew named Onias III took the office of high priest in Jerusalem. To Antiochus, the position of high priesthood was more or less a position of local governorship. He was a man who he figured he could just appoint or dismiss at will. Now, to Orthodox Jews, however, high priesthood was divinely appointed, and it had always been a position occupied by the descendants in the line of Tzadok. This is the name from which we get the word Sadducee. Jason, the brother of this Onias, had bribed King Antiochus to make him high priest instead of Onias. This Jason, note the Greek name, wanted to abolish the traditional theocracy and, quote, received from Antiochus permission to convert Jerusalem into a Greek polis called Antioch, end quote. Now, not long after, perhaps as a sort of karmic consequence, a guy named Menelaus, again, note the Greek name, then bribed Antiochus to replace Jason as high priest and have Onias assassinated. Next thing you know, Menelaus' brother is plundering Solomon's temple for holy objects, and this prompts a riot which gets him killed. The locals are whipped up into a fury on account of the desecration of the temple, and Menelaus is arrested for Onias' murder. They put him on trial before Antiochus, but the guy just bribes his way out of trouble as per usual. Now, following this event, Jason the Hellenizer drives Menelaus out and resumes his position as high priest. Furious that his puppet had been ousted, Antiochus IV attacked Jerusalem, pillages the temple, and, quote, took captive the women and children in the year 168 BC. From this point onward, the irate Antiochus pursued a zealous Hellenizing policy in the Seleucid satrapies. Here, for the first time, we begin to see a top-down imposition of Greek values over the people of Judea, and needless to say, this does not end well. Out of this whole affair emerges a great body of biblical literature describing parts of this process, which we call the Books of Maccabee. The first book of Maccabees frames the Maccabean revolt as a Star Wars-like uprising of pious Jewish rebels against the evil foreign Seleucid king, who was doubtless trying to eradicate their religion, and against the Jews who supported him. The author of the second book of Maccabees describes the conflict as a fight between Judaism and Hellenism, concepts which the author of that book actually coined. Thank you. Now, most modern scholars tend to argue that King Antiochus more or less took advantage of a brooding civil war between traditionalist Jews in the Judean countryside and Hellenized Jews in Jerusalem. Remember our core periphery dynamics. Nevertheless, it's pretty well accepted that it was the king's direct persecution of the religious traditionalists that was the immediate cause for the revolt. So, while most say that the Maccabean revolt was less of an uprising against foreign oppression than a civil war between Orthodox and Reformist parties in the Jewish camp, there are obviously some scholars who tend to stress the persecution element. Gymnasia didn't cause a war. Forcing people to eat pork and blaspheming the altar with a pig sacrifice did. In this conflict over the office of high priest I just mentioned, we can see traditionalists with Hebrew and Aramaic names like Onias contesting with Hellenizers with Greek names like Menelaus and Jason. To most scholars, it's from the clash of cultures which problems arise. And then obviously there are other scholars, namely the strictly Marxist kind, who point to social and economic factors as the roots of the conflict. Ultimately, what started as a civil war eventually started looking like a full-on foreign invasion, as many conflicts in this region do. And this was especially the case after the Hellenistic kingdom of Syria had allied itself with the Hellenizing Jews against the traditionalists. As the number of skirmishes escalated, Antiochus proscribed the practices of the traditionalist Jews, and thereby, imparting from typical ancient practice, he made the religion of an entire people illegal. Now, Antiochus's motives remain unclear. He may have been incensed at the overthrow of his appointed high priest Menelaus. Let's not forget the millennia-long precedent of closeness between rulers and religious authorities in the Middle East. This whole ordeal was really anomalous. Alternatively, Antiochus may have been egged on by a group of radical Hellenizers among the Jewish populations, leading him to respond to an Orthodox Jewish revolt that was centered upon the temple and the Torah as a symbol of its strength. So, in 1st Maccabees, we get an account of how Antiochus banned many traditional Jewish and Samaritan religious practices. He made possession of the Torah a capital offense. He burned all the scrolls of it that he could find. He outlawed Sabbaths and feasts. He prohibited circumcision, even to such an extent that mothers who circumcised their babies were killed with their families. And that age-old clockwork ritual sacrifice performed in the Holy of Holies at the Temple of Jerusalem was strictly forbidden. Now, here's the most egregious part. here's where the shit hit the fan. This would go down in history in Greek as to delugma tes eremoseos, the abomination of desolation. What Antiochus did was essentially the most unforgivable thing one could do within this context. And that's that he had a giant idol of Olympian Zeus placed on the altar of the temple, to whom were then sacrificed unclean animals within the holiest precincts of Yod-He Vav-He. Let's keep in mind that the theme of ritual purity is more or less foundational to the whole temple system. Absence from pollution was the sine qua non of that temple's existence. This was a blasphemous outrage to the brand image, to say the least. Now, in both biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, the word abomination is a familiar term for idol. The book of Daniel is filled with references to this abomination, but according to 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 54, one of these abominations was erected on the altar of burnt offering, where the holocausts were traditionally offered up. 1 Maccabees 1:54 says, "Now the 15th day of the month Caslu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side." Now, of course, in the face of such an insult, and let's be real, that's exactly what this was, it was a deliberate affront. What happens? Well, after Antiochus IV issued his decrees forbidding Jewish ritual, a rural priest named Mattathias the Hasmonean sparked a revolt by refusing to worship Greek gods. Mattathias was present at a sacrifice for an Olympian, and just as some Hellenistic Jews stepped forward to offer sacrifice to an idol, he jumped in and slew the man he perceived as a spiritual traitor, because obviously where you were born should dictate where you worship. Immediately, he and his 5 sons fled into the wilderness of Judah. Now, about a year later, in 166 BC, the son of the newly deceased Mattathias, Judas Maccabee, Maccabee means the hammer, by the way, led an army of anti-Greek dissidents through guerrilla warfare to oust the Seleucid dynasty. As you could imagine, this became a very bloody conflict, given that their operations were first directed at Hellenizing Jews. The Maccabees literally went around destroying pagan altars in the rural villages, circumcising boys, and forcing Jews into armed service toward their cause. Now, this revolution consisted of many battles, none of which were really decided out on a field of battle in the manner of traditional warfare. Once the Greeks got tired of fighting, the Maccabees entered Jerusalem in triumph and ritually cleansed the temple. They reestablished traditional Judean temple brand worship, and they set up Jonathan Maccabee as the high priest. Now, here's where we get one of those what-if historical moments, since a large Seleucid army was sent to go crush the rebellion, but had to return to Syria on account of the very untimely death of Antiochus IV. Who knows what would have happened if they had made it? Now, being preoccupied with internal affairs, the Seleucid kingdom agreed to a political compromise which ultimately restored religious freedom to the region. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar to some degree with the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, and it's this event which prompted its inception. This is celebrated every year to commemorate the rededication of the temple following the Maccabees' victory over the Seleucids. According to rabbinic tradition, after the Maccabees took back the temple, they could only find a small jug of oil that had remained uncontaminated because it had been sealed. And though it only had enough oil to light the menorah for a single day, it miraculously lasted for 8 days. Now, after this rededication of the temple, the Maccabees' warriors became divided over the question of whether or not to continue fighting. At the time that the revolt had begun, that is, under the leadership of Mattathias, the fighting was purely perceived as a struggle for religious freedom from the Seleucids. Now that they had it, as the Maccabees realized how easy it is for a couple of guys with weapons to get together and flex their wills on people throughout the countryside, many of them wanted to keep the revolt going and use the turmoil to their advantage to conquer other lands with Jewish populations, or to convert the people in those lands who weren't Jewish. The conflict exacerbated the slowly eroding divide between the Pharisees, that is the scribes, and the Sadducees, the priestly class. And such a conflict would only swell under the upcoming line of rulers, the native Hasmonean monarchs such as Alexander Jannaeus. Those who wished to keep fighting were led by Judah Maccabee, who in 160 BC was killed in battle and succeeded by his younger brother Jonathan, who was already high priest. Thereafter, Jonathan forged treaties with various neighboring allies, and this led to further dissent between those who merely desired religious freedom and those who wanted to keep the wheels of war turning in search of greater power. I want to remind you of a theme we've been covering throughout this series when it comes to Israel. Remember that constant dialectic of falling in and out of God's favor. This discourse really fueled the events to come immediately thereafter. In 142 BC, in his own turn, Jonathan was assassinated by a pretender to the Seleucid throne, and he was succeeded by his younger brother, the last remaining son of Mattathias, Simon Maccabee. Now, Simon gave support to Demetrius II Nicator, the Seleucid king, and in return, the Maccabees were exempted from tribute. From this position, Simon started going on the offense to expand his territories. He conquered the port town of Joppa, where a Gentile population were removed by force. He expelled the garrison from Antiochus's fortified Acra in Jerusalem, and in 140 BC he was recognized by an assembly of the priests, leaders, and elders as high priest, military commander, and ruler of Israel, all in one. Their decree became the basis of the Hasmonean kingdom. Not long from here, our friends over at the Roman Senate, who we've been neglecting to discuss for some time, they wind up renewing their alliance with this newly forged Hasmonean kingdom, much to the chagrin of the Seleucids. Although the Maccabees had secured their autonomy, the region technically remained a province of the Seleucid Empire, and Simon was required to levy troops for the king. It was only when Simon would refuse to give up the territory he had forcefully taken that Antiochus took them back by force. Antiochus conquered the entire district of Judea, but this time the Seleucid king refrained from attacking the temple or interfering with Jewish observances. He'd learned his lesson. Upon the death of Antiochus in 129 BC, however, Judea was freed from Seleucid rule. Independent Hasmonean rule lasted from about 129 to about 63 BC, which is the year that the Roman general Pompey strolled into the land and casually made it a client kingdom of Rome as a larger project of subduing the whole Near East. The final nail was driven in the coffin for the Hasmonean dynasty in 37 BC, when the Idumean Herod the Great became king of Israel and was given the designation, quote, King of the Jews by the Roman Senate. This effectively transformed the Hasmonean kingdom into a Herodian kingdom, a client kingdom of Rome. By 100 BC, The once formidable Seleucid Empire encompassed little more than Antioch and a handful of Syrian cities. Despite the clear collapse of their power and the decline of the kingdom around them, nobles continued to play kingmaker on a regular basis, with occasional intervention from Ptolemaic Egypt and other outside powers. It's been argued that the Seleucids existed solely because nobody else wanted to absorb them. They created a really sweet buffer zone between would-be hostile neighbors, which is why by the time we get to the wars in Anatolia between Mithridates VI of Pontus and Sulla of Rome, by both major combatants. Alright, so that's enough blow-by-blow history for now. What I want to do now is take a moment to talk about one of the most misunderstood set of documents in the world, and those are the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, allegedly written by this mysterious group of desert ascetics called the Essenes. Now, if I had a dime for every time I heard misinformation about either the Essenes themselves or the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'd be retired by now. The Essenes were a sect of the Second Temple period, which flourished from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD, and they were an offshoot of Sadducite priests, the Sadducees. Being much fewer in number than the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these are, I guess you could say, the other two major sects in the religious landscape, the Essenes lived in various cities, but also congregated in ascetic communities scattered throughout the desert. The Essenes have gained much fame in modern times as the result of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, which is commonly believed to be the Essenes' library, though ultimately there is no proof that the Essenes actually wrote them. We have references to this group in Pliny the Elder and Josephus. Josephus tells us that the Essenes practiced celibacy, voluntary poverty, strict obedience of Sabbath, daily immersion, communal meals and prayer, and they had a developed system of angelology. Qumran is an archaeological site just northwest of the Dead Sea in Jordan. In the Hellenistic period, a settlement was constructed there during the reign of John Hyrcanus in 134 to 104 BC. Note this rather late date relative to the rest of our talk. And there it stood occupied until it was sacked by the Romans in 68 AD. It is best known as the settlement nearest to the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. Excavations at Qumran itself have exposed over 900 scrolls, cisterns, Jewish ritual baths, and cemeteries, along with a dining room and some debris from an upper story alleged to have been a scriptorium. Most, but not all, experts believed this was home to the Essenes. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls did not begin with the discovery of a cave by a Bedouin boy, however. Rather, it began in the 19th century with the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, which was essentially a kind of honorable garbage dump for Jewish documents which contained the name of God. You don't burn them, you bury them in a room underground, and in the dry climate of Egypt, this does wonders for preservation. Among the Geniza were found two manuscripts now called the Damascus document. These were published in 1911. And these were also found later among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was debated at first whether these documents belonged to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or the Essenes, and this debate carried on until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. In the late 1940s, Jordanian Bedouin began a search to find where the Dead Sea Scrolls might have come from, because the cave in which they were first found was clearly not a library, but instead a drop-off site where the scrolls were put away to be hidden, probably from invading Romans during the late 60s AD. The Jordanian government became worried because Bedouins were digging up national treasures and selling them off to various foreign antiquities departments. And so a team was put together of predominantly Christian scholars to work on the scrolls. And this was because Jews were not allowed in Jordan at the time. One of the few non-Christian scholars working on this project was John Allegro, the author of The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, but that's neither here nor there. What this team of scholars did was they laid out all the material into glass plates for preservation and handling. Then they determined that from among the 1,200 plates of fragments, there were about 900 documents in total. Excavators were then sent to work at Qumran, where they found water cisterns, a variety of ritual baths, a defensive tower, an assembly hall, a scriptorium, and a cemetery. What the excavators determined is that this site had been used as a defensive outpost as early as the Iron Age. These defense towers caused a lot of speculation and one-man theories. Some believed it was indicative of a Roman military structure, but then this raised questions for others as to why Romans had Jewish ritual baths, buried their corpses with their feet facing Jerusalem, and had collections of Jewish manuscripts hidden in nearby caves. The case was simply that the people who lived at Qumran required a guardhouse. Since the evidence was overwhelming, it was determined that those who inhabited the site were unambiguously Jewish. The chronology for the main part of the site ran from after 150 BC on through a destruction layer, probably caused by an earthquake in 31 BC, and then onto a destruction layer in 68 AD, caused by the Romans. Many stone vessels were found at the site, and the widespread use of these objects matched up with the notion among the Jews that stone vessels are not subject to ritual impurity. There was also found a room into which a room on the second floor had collapsed, and that second floor room is thought to have been a scriptorium. One prominent Dead Sea Scrolls scholar believes that the documents found at Qumran were not necessarily written by the people living there, but were certainly copied there. Now, some texts may have been written there because we have coins in the wreckage which can date this part of the site. But the cemeteries at the site of Qumran sparked a major debate as well as to whether the sect there had been celibate or not. Now, since the leaders of the church were celibate, it was assumed that the sect at Qumran was celibate. There was a tremendous effort on behalf of Christians which tried to claim the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were really Christians, or some strange group of proto-Christians who could foresee the coming of Jesus, and therefore there was an attempt to interpret the scrolls in the light of the New Testament, especially by anachronistically and erroneously interpreting the so-called teacher of righteousness as Christ. I hear this kind of stuff all the time, even to this day. But alright, let's be real. The texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls contain no traces of the New Testament, and the document which some scholars tried to pass off as a Christian document literally contained 5 letters, 3 of which were the Greek kappa, alpha, and iota, which makes the word chi, and. Now, if this sect was indeed made up of Essenes, then we have a reference in Josephus which claims that there are 2 types of Essenes, marrying and non-marrying. The Manual of Discipline / the Rule of the Community didn't mention any women, but then again, neither does the U.S. Constitution. In light of the text's instructions to get married and have children, however, it's probable that the sect was not celibate, or if anything, they were post-maritally celibate. Whoa. Now, something amazing is that virtually all of the Hebrew Bible was recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and on top of this, there were a bunch of apocryphal works too. These texts were not authored by those at Qumran, and were not even necessarily copied there. Texts just like them were also found at Masada. The biblical works, such as the Isaiah scroll, were rewritten in a dialect used by the people at Qumran, but the differences were not so remarkable. The Ten Commandments are still the Ten Commandments. The scrolls of most interest to scholars were those pertaining to the group living at Qumran. These scrolls included religious teachings such as predestination, imagery of a battle between light and darkness, messianic views, and prayers and rituals particular to this specific group of Jews. This sort of stuff was quite unique and quite telling too. Now, the other key document I wanted to discuss, which was also in the Cairo Geniza, sets forth the idea that after the first temple was destroyed, most Jews went astray, and only the sectarian group led by the descendants of Sabaoth, the first priest of the first temple, went down the right path. The document gives us a code of Jewish laws concerning the Sabbath, oaths, testimony, purity and impurity, etc. The text found at Qumran proved that the documents found in the Cairo Geniza were truly from the same collection. Next, there's the Manual of Discipline, which reveals the theological details about the sect, such as the belief in predestination and the degrees of initiation into the sect. It was this document which led people to believe that the Qumran community were Essenes as described by Josephus and Pliny the Elder. But again, this is a leap of faith and not necessarily the truth. In 1984, there was a conference of biblical archaeology with a paper focused on a letter called the MMT/4QMMT, which shocked the world and eventually led to the reconstructing of the publication team and the publication of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. The letter was probably written around 152 BC when Jonathan Maccabee was high priest, and it is a criticism against his interpretation of the law. What had probably happened is that the Maccabees kicked out the Sadducite priests who had been too involved with Hellenistic activity for their liking. There were, however, some pious members of the Sadducite/Sadducee group who left Jerusalem and formed the Dead Sea sect, then wrote this letter explaining that the establishment was misled on matters of Jewish law. This view raised serious criticisms against the Essene hypothesis. According to the sectarians, this teacher of righteousness, some people wanted to be Jesus really, really, really badly, was the only one with the proper interpretation of Jewish scripture. And this proper interpretation was that all the works of the prophets actually pertained to the time of the Qumran sect and not to the time of the prophets themselves. Needless to say, this line of thinking hasn't left us. Now, in this catch of scrolls, we can also find a number of apocryphal works, such as works pertaining to Enoch, angelology, messianism, etc. You know, the kind of stuff which is of interest to occultists. Among these works, one scroll described a spiritual war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, which some interpreted in a proto-Christian or Gnostic light because of a mention of a Yeshua. This, however, is a reference to the Joshua of the Old Testament, not of Jesus Christ. Another one of these texts has a reference to a son of God. Nevertheless, what it proves is that there was a prominent messianic expectation among the Jews, and as there still is today, not that Jesus Christ's coming was being foretold. The pierced Messiah text, closely associated with the War Scroll, is part of a set which describes how the leader of the sect will pursue and defeat the leader of the Romans, but that the Romans will also kill the leader of the sect. Some scholars, therefore, assume these texts were making reference to Jesus, but according to Jewish scholars like Lawrence Schiffman, these scholars didn't know Hebrew grammar, and they had made a mistake with their translation of personal pronouns. So how could we trust them? I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I can't tell you. But it's quite probable that Schiffman is right and these other interpretations are false. Ultimately, the small number of parallels with the New Testament found in the Dead Sea Scrolls almost always disregard the context in which such parallels were found. In conclusion, what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a library of Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, not a collection of prophetic works anticipating the coming of Christ, as so many people wished and still wish it to be. Alright, well that about does it for today. Hopefully this information has been of use to you. By now you can probably tell that there really isn't a blanket way to describe the interactions between Greeks and Jews. Neither group was monolithic. Sometimes Jews and Greeks had a good time together, sometimes they had bad times. Some groups liked each other, other groups did not. This is the kind of thing we need to expect from history. Nuance. In any case, I'd like to thank you for all joining me. I'm Dan Attrell, and you've been listening to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History.